few of our regular contributors have noted that Sabine Hossenfelder got cancelled by the institution she was associated with in Munich. That didn't surprise me. Scientists who point out that the scientific establishment is promoting nonsense loud enough to be heard get cancelled. But what did surprise me when I watched her cancellation video was her conception of science. She often speaks of the scientific method. I'd assumed she was talking about Bacon's scientific method, with the clause requiring the abandonment of a disproved theory replaced by the establishment's best in the field dictum. But I didn't pick that up at all. So let's just review what the scientific method is. As we saw in episode 1, it was introduced in 1620 by Francis Bacon, who pointed out that the proto-science inherited from the Greeks was largely based on the reasoning of philosophers. At that time, science was usually called natural philosophy. Bacon pointed out that nature carries the stamp of the creator, but man's reason carries the stamp of his own folly. So Bacon put forward a new method of science, which constrained science to reasoning about observations of nature, not simply ideas coming from their own imaginations, as was the case with Aristotle and his colleagues. Bacon's book is not a quick read. Every sentence needs careful consideration. But his method can be summarised into 7 steps. 1. Observation and measurements. 2. Searching for patterns in the observations and measurements. 3. A hypothesis to explain the patterns in the observations and measurements. 4. Critical experiments to test the hypotheses. 5. If these experiments contradict the hypothesis, then seek a new one. 6. If much experimental evidence supports a hypothesis and none contradicts it, it can be considered a scientific theory. And 7. If any observation contradicts a theory or hypothesis, it must be abandoned. Scientists after Bacon recognised that science is utterly dependent on measurement. Mendeleev noted, science begins with measurement. Einstein said, what can be measured is science. Everything else is speculation. Kelvin said, when you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meagre and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely, in your thoughts, advanced to the stage of science, whatever the matter may be. In the light of this, let's see what Sabine said after being cancelled.
I am no longer affiliated with the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy. Germany, the land of the free thinkers. A lot of research in the foundations of physics is now pseudoscience. It hasn't followed the scientific method for decades. Thanks to you, I'm now fully financially independent, which is why I can, in contrast to many others, afford to publicly criticize academic research. But what does bother me is that some physicists still don't understand the problem with what they call science.
Well, she's been cancelled, but unlike most scientists, she can survive. But why does any scientist get cancelled? The big problem with science is that a very powerful group of intellectuals hated Bacon's pointing out that the problem with the proto-science of the past was that it did not acknowledge the Creator. It relied on man's reason. Those intellectuals considered themselves to be enlightened, freed from the bondage of blind allegiance to an all-knowing God, a God who had given us the Bible, a definitive handbook on how we should live if we wanted things to go well with our lives. They produced their own handbook, the Humanist Manifesto, which claims that humanists believe that the responsibility of our lives and the kind of world in which we live is ours and ours alone. God, even if he did exist, is irrelevant. He has nothing to tell us. We, and we alone, can decide how we live our lives. They even spun the story that Bacon was inspired by the wisdom of man and supported their ideas. They spun the story that Isaac Newton, who was a devoted Christian, who wrote more on scripture than on science and mathematics together, had made God unnecessary, because he had shown that man's reason can deduce the workings of the universe. When they took over professional science, they were confident that the theories which their worldview relied on, Lyell's vast ages of time, and Darwin's biological evolution, were true. They were convinced that their atheist, humanist worldview would be fully confirmed by science. But genuine research, following the scientific method, showed that evolution was not possible, as we saw in episode 10. The vast ages of time were wrong, and their worldview was not supported, as we saw in episode 26. The scientific method demanded that they abandon those disproved theories and look for better hypotheses, but no replacements conforming to their worldview could be found. So they brought in the best in the field dictum, ably stated by Thomas Kuhn as, once it has achieved the status of a paradigm, a scientific theory is declared invalid only if an alternative candidate is available to take its place. So now, if scientists like Sabina publicly acknowledge that today's version of science is on the wrong track, they must be silenced. But Sabina is a heroine. She dares to tell us just how pathetic today's so-called science has become.
Of course, I'm not the only one who has noticed this problem. I call it mathematical stories or mathematical fiction or just bullshit. Others have called it mathematical gymnastics or fairy tale physics. It's why David Lindley declared the end of physics, and one of the reasons why John Horgan declared the end of science. I'm not making any particularly novel observation here. But it keeps going on. This is what blows my mind. It doesn't matter how obviously this is pseudoscience. It doesn't matter how many people call out this problem, how many books are written about it. It doesn't matter what I say in any of my videos. It keeps going. They keep on producing more of these garbage papers each day, and they continue to get published, and they continue to get paid for it. And then they put out press releases, and the media picks it up, and people ask me what I think, and I say it's bullshit, because that's what it is. The problem is widely known among people in the field who tend to acknowledge it privately but would never admit to it in public because their money and their reputation depends on it. Well, most of them wouldn't admit it. One of the fearless exceptions is Will Kinney. Will works on cosmology, more specifically inflation, which is one of those highly problematic areas.
Problematic areas? What are they? They're areas like inflation which are so obviously nonsense one might wonder why they are allowed to pretend to be science. Inflation was brought in to try to save the Big Bang from extinction. It's one of the essential keys to the current paradigm of a creator-free universe. Observations show that the background radiation coming from all around us is as uniform as we would expect from the Bible's universe bounded by the waters above. But their beloved Big Bang would have produced very non-uniform radiation corresponding to the non-uniform distribution of galaxies and voids, which they tell us about. So inflation was promoted to smooth it out. Within the first moment of the Big Bang, the entire universe would have had to expand or inflate at many millions of times faster than the speed of light, and then suddenly slow down to below the speed of light in a tiny fraction of a second. Could anyone actually believe such nonsense?
One of the fearless exceptions is Will Kinney. Will works on cosmology, more specifically inflation, which is one of those highly problematic areas. Here is what he recently wrote on X Twitter. There are papers on inflation on the archive almost every day, usually more than one. It's an impressively productive field. But the vast majority of those papers are model building, writing down a slightly tweaked version of a previous model and working out its consequences. There's no limit to the number of papers that can be produced this way. It's very productive. But the papers are mostly useless. Nobody, including the people writing the papers, has any realistic expectation that any of these models are correct. They're just an exercise in empty mathematical world building. What prompted Will to write this was a book that appeared recently, The Ant Mill by Jesper Grimstrup, also a theoretical physicist. Let me just read you how Jesper summarized this. I've written a new book about the sociology of theoretical high-energy physics. The field is in crisis. No major breakthrough in 50 years and yet a remarkable absence of conceptually new ideas. My analysis shows that a massive social force towards mainstream research has emerged, a force that pushes the field towards tribalism and groupthink and prevents young researchers from pursuing their own independent research interests. That is 100% correct. And this isn't just about the tax money that's being wasted. Think about what all those intelligent people could do if they didn't waste their time on this nonsense.
And recently, there were some very interesting contributions in the comments. Peter Lean told us that real science is being done outside the universities by people like himself doing their own research. And remember what Gregory Chaitin said in episode 111. He's sorry for young people hoping to do exciting and original research at universities. He pointed out they would end up in a paper production sausage factory, working on pure nonsense.
But I'm not causing the problem. I'm just drawing attention to it. The fact is that the people in this discipline have invented mathematical stories for non-existing laws of nature for decades. They invent new particles, they invent new forces, they invent modified gravities. There are hundreds of tales for the beginning of the universe, multiverses, extra dimensions, and so on. You see some of this in the popular science headlines every day, and it's like naturopathy. There's zero evidence that it works. What's wrong with it is that we've learned that such hypotheses are not worth our time. We've learned that just making a random guess without any basis in evidence will just lead to false hypotheses, and testing them wastes time and money. You don't even need to know the reason for why it doesn't work. All you need to know is that we've learned from past mistakes that hypotheses based on, say, numerology aren't worth testing.
But now we get to see that although Sabina can see catastrophic results, she has no idea why this is happening. It looks as if she was never told about real science. In real science, a hypothesis is an attempt to explain patterns in observations. She doesn't even mention observations, never mind patterns in the observations. There have to be a large number of varied observations to reveal patterns. Sabina doesn't seem to realise that there have to be any observations at all for a hypothesis to be scientific.
They've been inventing mathematics to explain nothing. There's no data in need of explanation, and those aren't theories which solve any problems either. They're all superfluous, unnecessary hypotheses, useless papers, bullshit papers. They produce them in the thousands, do some calculations to make predictions, and if these predictions can be falsified, they will be falsified. This method of hypothesis generation has not worked ever since it began in the 1970s. The only predictions in those research areas which turned out to be correct in the past decades go back to before the 1970s.
As we saw in episode 5, the scientific establishment realized that the scientific method destroys the stories which are absolutely indispensable to their secular worldview. In the 1960s, they began to wage a campaign against the scientific method. In the 1970s, they expelled it from professional science, but they continued to pretend they still somehow accepted it for public consumption. As Sabina points out, since that time, science has fallen apart completely.
What did physicists do differently before the 1970s? Well, that's what I analyzed in my book Lost in Math. In a nutshell, in the first half of the 20th century, they were solving real problems rather than making up pseudo-problems to justify their pseudoscience. This is my explanation anyway. But whether you think my explanation is plausible, it doesn't change the fact that clearly something did go wrong in the 1970s. Yet physicists continue to use their failing method of theory development. Why? Because it easily produces papers that get published.
And here we get to the crux of the problem. As we saw in episode 5 and 77, Enlightenment science has to keep on with disproved hypotheses, no matter how obviously false they are, until an alternative acceptable to the establishment is approved.
these papers get published because they refuse to update their quality standards, and this is why it's pseudoscience. It does not follow the scientific method. The scientific method requires that you learn from mistakes.
Well, yes. That is the 7th point in the scientific method. 7. If any observation contradicts a theory or hypothesis, it must be abandoned. But without the scientific method, Sabina has to make up ways to learn from mistakes by waiting to find out that nothing useful turns up. Anyone applying the scientific method would have thrown out such false hypotheses immediately.
What's happening in these areas instead is that they pile more and more guesses on top of each other. Each time I look, it's worse. They now have dark sectors of several hundred invisible particles, fifth forces that mysteriously shield themselves in the solar system so that we can't measure them, extra dimensions that are always just a little bit too small to be detected, fields with quantum fluctuations that produce infinitely many universes. There's maths for that, so you can get it published.
And here we get to the establishment's great get-out-of-jail strategy. The publish or perish treadmill. Doing real science requires making a large number of different kinds of measurements, enough to recognise patterns. It requires hypotheses to explain those patterns. Experiments must be designed and performed to check out the hypotheses. All that takes a great deal of time, ingenuity and effort. But then there's the chance of those investigations again disproving the establishment's essential tenets. So the publish or perish treadmill ensures that research is done on some tiny part of a question which will not be an embarrassment to the establishment. And more of these so-called research projects don't involve any experimental observations and measurements at all. They involve playing mathematical games with fairy story models, make-believe particles, imaginary entities and even universes which nobody can detect, never mind measure. Or they just make comments on what others have written. And all this is because the Enlightenment humanists cannot bear to have their essential atheist worldview exposed as a lie. And since the establishment owns the journals which they recognise as scientific, and which they require scientists to publish in to be recognised as scientists, they're definitely not going to listen to Sabina's suggestions.
What can be done about it? It's fairly simple, actually. The journals which publish papers in those areas should just agree to stop publishing mathematical fiction. They should formulate guidelines for reviewers and make editorial decisions accordingly. Concretely, if it's proposing a new theory, does it only make assumptions that are necessary to explain existing data, yes or no? Does it solve a problem of mathematical consistency or at least work towards it, yes or no? If the answer is no, don't publish it. If the journals and the foundations of physics would do this, that'd solve 99% of the problem within a week. It doesn't happen because the journals also benefit from the paper production. You see, the more papers they publish and the more these papers get cited, the easier it is to convince libraries to subscribe, and round it goes. And that they all benefit from this pseudoscience is why it continues.
They're happy with the floods of worthless papers which keep potential out-of-the-box thinkers away from challenging their secular worldview. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and press the bell so that you'll be notified as I release new movies. If you'd like to support this project, you're welcome to do so through Patreon. Find a link on my channel banner and in the description below.